Hello and welcome back to another class. I'm sure you had a great time at our previous class, just learning about the structural overview of the Old Testament scriptures and looking at the first part of that, which is the foundational things. Just by way of refreshing your memory, we did say that a great breakdown is that we look at the foundational, which comprise of the first five books of Moses, the Pentateuch or the Torah, and we look through all of that. And we said the historical is when people started living out the things that were set out in the foundational. So, in this lesson, we want to see what happened during the historical era. Were the people able to live consistent with what God had laid out in the foundational, or were they living contrary to what God had set out? A good way to look at this structure, again, because this cut across several books, so starting from Joshua, Judges, Ruth, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, Nehemiah, Ezra, Esther. So it's a lot of books. So we're not going to take them one by one like we did with the foundational book, which were only five. However, this time around, I want to follow a little bit of a different structure, something that looked like this. The whole period of the historical event, it's majorly characterized by kings and kingdoms. So what I've done is to take all of those history and break them down into the various period, which is before kings and kingdom and during kings and kingdom. So if we want to break it down broadly, that would be before kings and after king. But more specifically, before king and after kings, it also has its own subcategory. So kings and kingdoms that were united, and at some point it became fragmented or divided kingdom. So, and then, which is where things started getting really complicated when you begin to read or study the Bible. And then from there, we begin to see again consequence and reward. And mostly that is characterized by judgment and exile, and God's mercy again being characterized by their return to their own land. So let's get this started. Now, we stopped in the first five books speaking about how Moses had led the people. Unfortunately, Moses, though a great leader, eventually died by the time we saw Deuteronomy. So a part of Deuteronomy were his words, and some parts were not because he died at some point there. After that, Joshua took over. And Joshua was a fine leader. Joshua was a fine leader. He was a fine leader because he had learned from Moses. In fact, the Bible says because Moses had laid hand on him. So he was a fantastic leader. He led like Moses. Now, in Joshua's tenor of leading the people, one of the things that we saw very importantly, or that the book of Joshua showed us more vividly, is that the fact that God had promised something does not change the fact that we have a role to play. As a matter of fact, God is calling us onto partnership. When you come into the New Testament, you see the same thought being echoed by Paul when he says we are God's partner, we are God's co-worker, all right, and we are supposed to do good works, all right. So again, we are invited into a partnership with God. So the fact that God is with us does not mean that we don't have a role to play. And we see also that through Joshua. Joshua fought the most battle. He took territories that they were afraid to take up until that time. He fought a lot of battle. And you begin to wonder, for someone that the Lord continually promised that he is with him, for someone that the Lord continually promised that he has delivered the land into their hand, it was a lot of fighting that Joshua was doing, but that's because the fact that God has given us something, has delivered something to us, does not change the fact that we have a role to play, all right, in executing it. So we saw that with Joshua. Now, after Joshua, there wasn't great succession, really. There wasn't any clear leader or someone who understudied Joshua, just like Joshua did with Moses. So things began to fall apart from that point. And that's where we saw the book of Judges. One of the key phrases that you will see more often as you read through the book of Judges is that during that period, there was no king and people did as they please. People did as they please. A response to that, because when people begin to do as they please, they are bringing themselves to a point where they could be attacked by the enemy. They are opening themselves up. So we saw that in the life of Israelites, that they continually opened themselves up because they did not follow the leading of God. Now, it wasn't God punishing them, it was God trying to rescue them from the things they want to get themselves into. It's very important that we understand that difference. It wasn't, God is not being vindictive. All along, God's instruction is to save us from the self-destruction that we are walking into. When we don't follow those instructions, we ultimately find ourselves in the self-destruct, which is the consequence of where we are trying to lead ourselves into. So God is not he's not being vindictive, right? He's all along, and the way you know that is that for every time they get themselves into this trouble by following their own way, God always finds a way to raise a leader to rescue them. And we saw that thing continuously in the book of Judges. Different judges rising up, and bringing the people back to God, gaining their victory. They fall back into their sin, and the cycle went on and on and on. But the key thing was that the people just want to do as they please. It's interesting because during this time that the people of God, who have the covenant of God, who knew God, who have experienced God, were trying to do as they please. It was also at this time that a young lady, a Moabitess, Moabitess, who got married to a Jewish person in a foreign land where they had traveled to because of famine, made up her mind that she really wanted to be committed to this God of Israel. How ironic. The people who have experienced God were living the way they please. And the person who has not experienced God was willing to be committed to this God of the Jews. It's just so ironic. And the name of that young lady or woman is Ruth. A book was written after her. It was composed of her story throughout that process. It was a journey of finding God, but not just finding God and finding purpose. She was later to become one of the few women who were not Jewish who found themselves in the lineage of Jesus Christ. Fun fact, you do remember that one of the times we've had this kind of scenario was way back when the Israelites was trying to spy the land. There was this prostitute woman, Rahab, you remember her. And it so happened that Rahab became the mother of a Jewish man. Okay, he got married to a Jewish man, okay, Salmon, and gave birth to a Jewish son by the name, wait for it, Boaz. And ultimately, Boaz was the one who eventually married Ruth. It's interesting because Boaz, knowing that her mother was not of Jewish origin, is who is best positioned to be able to look at Ruth and not see a woman who is not Jewish, but seeing a woman who has so much faith in God, just like her mother. All right. So, again, I think Ruth is also a key learning curve for us as believers, that sometimes the things that we go through, painful as they may be sometimes, are strengthening us and positioning us to be able to tend to the wound of others, as time goes on. And that those are some of the things that we saw before the era of the king. Now, as we move to First Samuel and Second Samuel, and of course Kings, which talks about kings, one of the things we now begin to see is a time when Israelite got tired of the kingdom of God. Again, remember we talked about this earlier on in this course, that as God is trying to build a kingdom where he can instruct the people and he can tell them what is good and what is not good, the people were continuously trying to be rebellious. All right. They continuously were trying to just prove to God that they want what they want. Okay. So during the period of when Samuel the prophet was leading them, the people demanded for a king. And it's interesting because nothing catches God by surprise. Remember, as far back as Deuteronomy, God knew that at some point in the future they were going to ask for a king. And what did God do? God actually made provision for how that king should live. All right. And it's interesting that at this time they are asking for a king because they want to be like other nations. This request God granted, and he gave them the first king, a man by the name of Saul. Okay, and Saul didn't exactly live the best of life. Saul was symbolic of the people. He started out well, but as time goes on, he started deciding for himself what is good and what is evil. So when God said destroy these people, he decides what he wants to destroy and what he doesn't want to destroy. Noble as they sound, that was symbolic of man's attempt to define what is good and what is evil, as opposed to listening to God about what is good and what is evil. And ultimately, even though God gave Saul a big room of repentance, he did not repent. And God raised another man by the name of David. But it's actually kind of interesting because before David became king of the United Kingdom, okay, when Israel was Israel having 12 nations or 12 tribes, because a time would come, and we'll get into that in a bit, where they will no longer be 12 tribes, okay? But before David actually became king, there was someone else who was king, a descendant of Saul. His name is Ishbosheth, and he ruled for quite a bit. Remember, three sons of Saul perished with him, during the war between Israel and Philistine, where Saul eventually died. And one of the nice people that died in that battle was the man by the name of Jonathan, a very good man by every standard. But after that, because Ishbosheth was not groomed for kingship, the person who was actually groomed for kingship was Jonathan. He became king, an accidental king, all right? And he became a puppet for his uncle, a man by the name Abner, and his uncle was indirectly ruling the kingdom until things fell apart between them, and as things goes on, Ishbosheth was eventually assassinated. But all through that period, the people in Judah were actually upset at the fact that this king who doesn't know what is right from his left was ruling Israel, and they pulled out from the kingdom and appointed David to be their own king. So David became king first in Judah, and ultimately, after the assassination of Ishbosheth, he became king of the entire Israelite nation. So he united the kingdom again, Judah and the entire kingdom. And then, of course, after David, his son Solomon also became king. And Solomon is synonymous for his wisdom from God. And something else is synonymous for his 1,000 plus spouses, wives, and concubines. All right. Um, but interestingly, I think one of the things that we need to also be able to set some records straight a little bit is that there is a quick assumption that Solomon married a lot of wives and had a lot of concubines because he's promiscuous. Maybe, just maybe. But actually, Solomon marrying so many wives was symbolic of something deeper than just love for women. Okay. Solomon married most of those women as a matter of diplomacy, as a matter of political alliance. All right. So, what Solomon was doing, and the reason why that is important is that we'll see a pattern very quickly forming. What Solomon really, really did wrong, all right, was that Solomon was trying to protect by his wisdom the things that God had given to him by his grace. God gave him this kingdom by his grace. He is not the heir apparent to the throne. God gave him wisdom to rule that kingdom and become literally one of the best king of that nation by his grace. In fact, the guy was so afraid that he would mess things up that the only thing he asked God for when God came to him after he built the temple was wisdom to lead the people. So Solomon became wise, ruled the kingdom, became great, but then he wanted to preserve that by making alliances, and that process led him. Okay, the wisdom of that decision was that he continued to marry, all these wives in order to be able to sustain that peace and harmony. And of course, so many of those women drew his heart away from God to idolatry. Okay, so after Solomon, his son Rehoboam came to power, and it was during his son's reign that everything scattered altogether. All right. So when his son Rehoboam came to power, one of the things he did first was to ask the counselors of his father how best to approach the kingdom. And they advised him, they gave him a fantastic advice. They told him, look, reduce the burden of the people and they will serve you. And, he went also to get advice from his, you know, Gen Z colleagues. And they gave him a very interesting advice. And they told him, you know what? You have no business reducing the burden of the people. If I tell them you are going to make their life more miserable than your father did. And it was where the phrase, to your tent, O Israel, came. It was a point where the nation scattered, all right, and split into two kingdoms. The kingdom of Israel, which is made up of 10 kingdoms, and the kingdom of Judah, which is made up of two kingdoms, Judah and Benjamin. Now, interestingly, even while Solomon was still alive, he has a chief of staff, so to speak, a worker, whose name is Jeroboam. Okay, so Solomon's son's name is Rehoboam. This staff name is Jeroboam. Okay, and God had promised him that, look, even though you are not from a royal family, out of my mercy, the kingdom is going to split, and I'm going to give you 10 of those kingdoms. Okay, but because I still love David, my servant, I'm going to reserve back two of those kingdoms. So those two kingdoms were the kingdoms of Judah and Benjamin. All right. So again, by some divine providence, this guy Jeroboam became the king over the 10 kingdoms, okay, of Israel, and Rehoboam, who is the son of Solomon, lost 10 kingdom and was left with just two kingdoms of Judah and of Benjamin. Now, one of the things I would want to show you is I'd like to show you something, and this might help you to remember the various kings. So if you look at this now, you see from David, from Saul to Ishbosheth to David, but things start getting complicated from the period of the divided kingdom. So as you begin to study the Bible, especially the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles, and you begin to hear names of different kings, it can get confusing very quickly, because you start wondering who is who again, especially because there are some names that appeared multiple times and all of that. You begin to wonder. A good clue to be able to figure it out is to ask yourself, where was this king reigning? Was he reigning in Judah, or was he reigning in Israel? Okay. And another name that you probably found in the Bible is North and South. The kingdom of Israel, which is the bigger one, the 10th kingdom, is called the Northern Kingdom. The kingdom of Judah, which is Judah and Benjamin, is called the Southern Kingdom. So always ask this person that they are talking about, where did they say he reigned? Did he reign in the north or in the south? Did he reign in Israel or in Judah? It's a very easy way to be able to navigate as you study those books. So key highlight, and you may want to again zoom in some of your study as you study through the historical book on this, is that in the northern kingdom, there were 19 kings. 19 kings. And all the 19 kings are bad. They did evil in the sight of the Lord. All the 19 of them. In Judah, there were 20 kings. Okay, there were 20 kings. 8 of them did good. Well, technically 6 of them. 2 of them were somewhere midway. But let's just say 8 of them, did good. So there were 20 kings. Let's just say 20 kings. Actually 19 kings and a woman, okay, by the name Atalia. She also ruled in Judah. So as you read through, you see so this might guide you, and I'm going to attach this into as part of the resources accompanying this video. So feel free to download it as PDF, so you can navigate your way through this to know who reigned where and at what time. Okay, so these are some of the things that you are going to see as you navigate through the book of the Kings. Okay, now back to our story of the divided kingdoms. During this period of divided kingdom, there was a particular story that was really sad. Okay, and it was the story of that young man, Jeroboam. You probably want to look into it. How so again, recall that Jeroboam was part of the I did say that all the kings, the 19 kings that ruled in Israel, they all did evil in the sight of the Lord. Maybe one of the questions that didn't cross your mind is that, wait a minute, Jeroboam, this guy who by divine providence received the kingdom, was also part of the king in 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 the northern Israel or in Israel. How is it that he still did evil? Well, simple. Even though God gave him 10 kingdoms, there was something very interesting that happened, which is uh, Jerusalem. Again, recall, there is only one temple in Israel. Only one temple. There were many synagogues as time goes on, but temple is only one. And that temple is in Jerusalem. Okay? And Jerusalem is in Judah. All right? So, as you read through the Bible and you see stories of people traveling all over the place to come into Jerusalem, now you understand why. Because there was only one temple. Okay, but that's besides the story. So, what happened over time is that people will move, even though the two kingdoms are already separated, people will still move throughout each of those festive period, all the way from every nation of Israel to Judah to go and worship. And at some point, this guy became envious of the fact that these two small kingdoms seems to have so much influence over his people, and the fundamental reason why that is happening is because of worship. So what he did was to say, you know what, if worship is the problem, I will create a worship system within Israel so that the people won't have to go to temple in Jerusalem. So what did he do? He decided to build high places. He built idolatry system. All right. And in order, just out of his ambition to keep the people, he took the people away from God and introduced them to idol. So he ended up doing evil. But did you notice a pattern here? Did you notice a pattern? The pattern is also consistent with what was the downfall of Solomon. Try to keep in human wisdom what they receive by divine providence. This guy is not royal, has no royalty in his blood. By divine providence, 10 kingdoms was handed over to him on a platter. He could have been grateful to that God. He could have trusted that God to keep those kingdoms, but he got worried. Fear got the best of him. Ambition got the best of him. And because of that, he tried to keep in his wisdom what was delivered to him by divine providence. Um, I, Before we close out on the historical study, now, like I mentioned, both kingdoms, whether of the north or of the south, they mostly did evil. So even with the kingdom of the south, where there were 8 people, 8/20 is not exactly a pass mark. That's less than 50% of the people that rule that did good in the sight of God. So what happened eventually was there were consequences. All right. So there were consequences, and that took us to the era of judgment and exile. And we saw all of those stories in Second Kings and in Second Chronicles. And to just take you through that very quickly, again, who do you think is going to get is going to get attacked by the enemy or go into judgment very first? Of course, Israel, the northern kingdom, because they were the most bad. Okay, all the kings there were bad. So they were the first to be captured. They were captured by Assyrians, and we will look back into that when we do our study on the instructional books. So they were captured by Assyrians, and Assyrians eventually, they have a very interesting policy. which is the policy of scattering people. Now, they captured the people, not necessarily to enslave them forever. They believe that the way to render the enemy powerless is to ensure that they are not together. So their foreign policy is to scatter the people. And of course, eventually, even though Judah could have learned from that experience, they didn't, and they were eventually captured as well. They were captured by, the Babylonians. So both of them, the reason why I'm taking time to go through that is because both of them were captured, but the nature of the judgment slightly differ. One was scattered, the other was enslaved. Because as we get into the instructional and you begin to see patterns of prophecy, it also gets you a sense of who exactly is prophesying, where the person is prophesying, to whom the person is prophesying. As you begin to see conversations about restoring people that are scattered, you know who exactly that message is for. When you start seeing conversation about return, you know who that is meant for. And then, of course, as I close out for this class, the final part of the historical piece is their eventual return. So, after all the scattering and after all the capture and enslavement, the last thing you also see is that God was merciful enough to bring these people back into their land. And they came back in batches. Okay, the first batch was led by a scribe, a teacher of the Lord named Ezra. And even though Ezra brought the people back, a good number of the people back, one of the things you realize is that they built a temple, but the wall of the city was still broken, which means they were so much susceptible to attacks and all of that. Eventually, there was a second movement which was led by Nehemiah, and that's what the book of Nehemiah was about. That movement expanded on the works that Ezra began, which was that this time they built the wall around Jerusalem so that Jerusalem is once again a fortified city. And finally, we saw the book of Esther. The book of Esther is about the people who didn't go with batch A, they didn't go with batch B, they remained in the land of slavery. And before we judge them, don't picture this. If you have migrated to a particular country and you've stayed there for a very long time, you've built wealth, you own houses, land, and all of that. Everything is going well for you there, and in your country, you don't exactly have anything on ground, and maybe the political atmosphere or things like that is not really that great where you are coming from. How easy will it be for you to just move your life once and just go back to your country? Maybe not so easy. Some probably will wait till when they are very old and retire back there, but not. So again, when you picture it that way, it was that there were a lot of people who also have a lot of things at stake in this land. Some of them were born into that slavery. They grew up there. It's all they've known. And now you are telling them about their country of birth, which, by the way, at this time is in shambles, is in ruin. There is nothing good to go back to, except you are really, really patriotic. So there were a lot of people who stayed back. And the book of Esther is the highlight of the things that they went through, the persecution that broke out against them. And that was led largely by a man by the name of Haman. Okay, Haman, he led that opposition against the Jewish people in that land. And it's interesting because his primary fight was with a Jewish man by the name Mordecai. Now, here is where it gets really interesting, and this is where we're going to close out today. The man Haman, the Bible tells us he was of the descendant of Agag. Meanwhile, The man Mordecai was of the descendant of Benjamin. Okay, now remember Saul, the first king of Israel, the guy who was always neglecting the instruction of God and doing what he liked. That guy is the first king that came, who came from the tribe of Benjamin. And interestingly, part of the kings that God had asked him to destroy back then was Agag, which he spared, and he did not destroy. Okay, so what we are seeing now in the book of Esther was more than just a random annoyance by one guy. It was one guy being enraged by historical generational battle. Again, the point why I'm telling you all of this is that whatever you don't deal with now, and God is asking you to deal with, maybe in your life or in life generally, if you don't take it seriously now, one day it will take you seriously, and you don't want to wait until that one day. So, if there is anything to pray about today, it is that God will help you to really see the impact of the decisions you are making today so that you can lean to His voice, and that way you know what is good according to God and what is truly evil according to God. So that is the historical in a nutshell. Up next, in our next class, we would be looking at the instructional books. I look forward to seeing you in the next class.